Welcome back to the Tide Generator podcast. In this episode, we're going to explore new ideas with 3D printing. In thinking about the ways the AV and experience design industries can expand and change, it's valuable to look to the periphery for new technologies and applications that connect our skills with new outputs. One area with a lot of potential is 3D printing, which is a valuable technique for design and prototyping. But what else might we do with it? On this episode of Tide Generator, we explore new ways that 3D printing might change experience design and create new avenues for work. Looking to the edge of what we might do with these tools, we ponder, what should we make next? All right. Well, welcome back to the Tide Generator podcast. Today, in this episode, we're going to ask the question, what should we make next? And in this episode, we're going to explore 3D printing. It's something that is a little bit adjacent to our industry. Maybe people have used it as a means of design and production and exploring new ways to build things. But we're also going to talk today with guests that can bring perspectives on where 3D printing is going and how it might actually be used in a variety of creative ways within experience design and AV. So I'd like to welcome my guests today. We have three distinguished people from different angles on this technology. Let's start with Christina Perla. She is the CEO and co-founder of Makelab. Hello, Christina.
Hi.
Welcome. Thanks for being here. And we have Victoria Bill. She is director of the MakerSpace LAB at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you.
And our third guest today is James Patton. He is the director and principal of Patten Studio, an experience design firm. Hi, James.
Hi, Kirsten. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I'm so glad to have all of you here because I think it's going to be really interesting. Our audience works in the fields that you work in and are going to be curious to hear what you're seeing out there. So I guess my first question to dive into this It's just kind of a broad question of what's new and cool in 3D printing right now. Maybe we'll start with Christina. What are you seeing out there?
Sure. So just a bit of background, Makelab is the 3D printing service bureau. So we see almost every type of application used, some realistic and doable, some very, very not doable. It's quite interesting. But one thing outside of use cases that really interests me is always multi-material 3D printing. So my background is industrial design. And so as an industrial designer, like before Makelab, I was doing a bunch of freelancing and I would have the need to prototype almost all the time. And when you prototype, you want to really mimic the materials the best that you can. So having multi-material 3D printing in forms of I think it's called polyjet. You can make different geometers of bending material, which is just freaking awesome. And you can also do multiple colors in polyjet and full color sandstone, which is just really cool. So you can do looks like prototypes and functions like prototypes pretty easily. It comes at a cost, but it's just still so exciting because back in my Pratt days, I would have to paint a bunch and fill in holes, prep it for paint, and then go through the painful process of finishing all my parts. So this would have saved a lot of time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's come a long way from those single color matte looking 3D printed objects, which are still useful and we're still all right. Cool. Yeah. Victoria, what are you seeing in the actual engineering world?
Yeah. So again, I'm the director of the Makerspace at NYU. We are actually open to all of NYU, but situated in the School of Engineering. So we get a lot of engineering related research and work. I think what we're really seeing, and we have a few faculty working on, and it kind of ties into what Christina said, but new materials and composites. And I think what makes that exciting is when that starts to really come into more of a consumer price range. Same with the new material, multi-material, full color printing. We're just now starting to see that kind of be a little more accessible, I think. And then, I think we're all still waiting for metal printing, right? It's out there. with $1 million machines. There are a few cheaper ones. I think laser sintering is how most metal printing is done. So, there's a lot of processing and hazardous materials that go into that process. So it'll be interesting to see, again, as in the next 10 years, as that becomes more approachable and maybe, can be housed in labs like ours.
James, how are you? So 3D printing is actually a part of your work in every way. So yeah, what are you doing with it right now?
So we're Patten Studio is an experiential design firm, and our focus is on bringing things that traditionally live on screens out into the physical world where people can touch and interact with them. And so we found that 3D printing is a really nice way to do that. And one of the developments that has been really interesting for us recently, at least in terms of accessibility, is different finishing options. So we just got a vapor polishing machine that is like fairly easy, where you take a print that comes out of an FDM printer, so it's got all these lines on the outside, and you put it in this machine, and then when you take it out of the machine, it's got a nice shiny finish that you could give to a client. So that's been really interesting for our work, because it really increases the kinds of things that we can do totally in-house, which is interesting because most of our clients want things on like really tight turnarounds. So that lets us do that and kind of be more adventurous in terms of the physical forms that we use.
What machine are you using for that?
It's called the Zortrax Apoller. It's pretty cool. So it'll polish with either acetone or MEK. So it does a variety of plastics, but we're mainly working in ABS.
Very cool. Very cool. I saw that.
Yeah, we couldn't really find too much about it before we pulled the trigger, but it was kind of we had a project on a tight deadline, and it was like pre-quarantine days, and we figured everything was going to shut down in a couple days, so just buy it now, hope it works. Unfortunately, it works well. So
been in myself where you just really hope for the best, but you need it so desperately, so you're just like, I'll take my chances.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I guess that immediately begs the question. So when you're talking about making something that you can immediately give to the client, you mean like to use in an actual experience design as an object, or using it for, like, how are you using it? Is it something that's a part of a project out there in the world, or?
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of things that we 3D print really vary, right? So like one example is, let's say we're doing an installation, and there are going to be 75 different cameras in that installation, and each one has to be mounted at a precise angle. And so rather than kind of manually adjusting each one on site, we'll 3D print all those camera mounts, so that because usually you have like very limited time on site to build these things. So that's kind of one extreme. Or if we do custom electronics, doing an enclosure for that. But then on the other extreme, unfortunately, there's some NDAs involved here, so I can't talk too much, but basically like the thing that people interact with is entirely 3D printed, and it's got so we do a lot of work with kinetics, so robotics, kinetic sculptures, that kind of thing. And so the shell of one of these pieces might be entirely 3D printed. So there's a pretty broad range.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. At least top secret things. Yeah. I know, Christina, you had mentioned that too, that that some of the camera jigs and stuff, like when you see entertainment and event work, you see people kind of making stuff at the last minute. Is that how you see it being used in entertainment?
Yeah, very much on the production side of the entertainment world. It's a lot of last minute things just to make logistics of setting up, like James said, a little bit more efficient, a little bit more streamlined, maybe a little bit more organized even. I've been in situations where you kind of have to like manually adjust things. And as you were saying that, James, I was like, oh, wow, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
So definitely in that sense. And in those cases, you really don't need the fancy, like expensive 3D prints. You can really go like the super basic material that prints super fast and just get something like out there, which is really convenient.
Okay. Yeah, actually, yeah, Victoria, that makes me want to ask the question that's kind of a nature that if people were trying to do these sort of last minute changes, how do they dive into starting to make these things happen? You've seen a lot of students probably pick this up pretty quickly. What are the first things you have to do, first moves you have to make to get into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is learning the design software. Maybe, okay, so if we want to take one step back, right? The first step for designing your own parts would be the software. And then, maybe you have a quick need. A lot of these files are already available online. A lot of designers and users share these things. So there are a lot of online communities where the files are already available, such as Thingiverse and others. So it could be as simple as a Google search and then reaching out to services like Christina's. But really, if you're ready to take that step kind of to design your own parts, or you have a very specific case, I mean, the software is out there. A lot of it's free. We see our students using things like Fusion 360 or SolidWorks because those are kind of industry standards. We have a lot of workshops, actually. So the Makerspace isn't just the tools, it's also the people here in the community, and we focus a lot on that. So some of our workshops are going to be recorded, and we'll be posting some of them, I think, for the public in the fall. But things like Intro to Fusion 360 we'll have available. But there's so much out there. I mean, I think just Googling, computer-aided design, CAD, is where a lot of people like to start, and then diving into the online tutorials that exist from these companies. They want you to use their software, right? And be hooked. And then it's reaching out to the services. The price of a 3D printer is dropping every day. I mean, there's printers available for $100 on Amazon, these small kits. It can be a great tool, I think, for parents and teachers as well, if you have the resources. I think it's only a leg up for students who have access to these in middle school and high school. We see a lot of our incoming students who really have these skills now. But there are so many resources out there that you shouldn't feel intimidated. It really is very approachable now, more than it has ever been. And anyone can pick it up. I'm here to tell you that.
It's really, you said that, Victoria, because last year we did like a little workshop with the American Museum of Natural History to like a bunch of second graders, and they were went in thinking, okay, let's start at ground zero with 3D printing and explain everything. These second graders were schooling us. Did not expect the level of knowledge that they actually had, and I was just so impressed. So going along with what you were saying, like, I'm just so happy that it's becoming a lot more accessible, especially to younger generations in their school curriculums.
Yeah, actually, that's making me think, Victoria, are you seeing a lot more? So a lot of students are showing up already kind of knowing about it, but are you finding that people from different departments, you mentioned people can use the Makerspace from all the different schools within NYU. Who are you seeing that's, I guess, what are the creative applications you're starting to see happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think, when the Makerspace first opened, we're in the School of Engineering, so it was mostly engineers. And back to, my comment on community, we don't want just the engineers, right? We need designers, we need artists to really make interesting things, to be honest, to make interesting projects and tackle interesting problems. So one thing that NYU did recently is they actually moved the ITP and other art and tech departments from Manhattan to one of the new buildings just across the street from the building I'm in. It's on 370 J Street. So when that happened last year, we started to definitely see a lot more of those students. They come from all kinds of backgrounds. They're interactive designers. There's been so many interesting use cases around, like, I would say, current social political topics, thinking about their own work and their own practices. And I think that's what we need. As engineers, we need to be pushed. I'm an engineer. We need to be pushed a little bit to think about, not just how can we fix this one problem, but how will the tools be used and how will our projects be used.
So how are you seeing, I guess, Christina, that makes me think too about the women in 3D printing and the notion of trying to pull in different people to join this industry. How are you? How can we keep pushing this and pushing the use of this into new fields?
I like to think back a lot to the way I got into 3D printing. I'm an industrial designer. Like I said before, I went to Pratt, but when I was at Pratt, I actually never touched the 3D printer that was there. I was purely like a laser cut girl. Like the 3D printer intimidated. It was very large outer shell, very, very small build volume. Seemed complex. It was shake. It was taller than me, so I just kind of stayed away. But so the way I got into it was just from a need and then an interest, and it was just that spark of inspiration of knowing I can realize my designs without having to go to a bandsaw or figure out how I'm going to carve this thing out of like a block of modeling foam or whatnot, and how many steps it saved me. And so I try to approach it that way. And there's so many use cases with 3D printing. It's got such a wide reach across many different industries that I think it has the ability to inspire creativity and problem solving like almost anywhere. So in 3D printing, in women in 3D printing at the meetups, like that's what I usually start to talk about with people and engage interest from there. And I kind of wrap in my story. I tell them my story, they tell me theirs, and then we have a connection, and it's like you have a friend in the industry. So if they were on the edge about trying to find a job in this industry or not, hopefully our conversation or a conversation with someone else at the meetup will inspire them to kind of move forward and apply to something and be a little different.
Yeah, I guess James, from an aesthetic point of view, how do you feel that this is evolving? If you're making these objects that people are interacting with in an experience now, do you feel like 3D printing has arrived to a point you've got this special, even more beautiful, this beautiful new machine that makes things even more perfect as they print out? But from an aesthetic point of view, do you think that now, like, the experience design world's ready to have more 3D printed objects in it?
Sure. I mean, I think the challenge with kind of any shiny new tool, and this is true with like laser cutting or anything, is that there's a certain like design vocabulary that a tool encourages, and you can sort of diverge from that if you want to, but it takes a little bit of effort. And so like, sometimes I think it's like not as bad now, but back in the day, like you could see a flyer on the street and you could say, oh, that was done in PowerPoint, because just that tool encouraged some very specific design choices, and like you could go away from them, but that took effort. And in 3D printing, it's more flexible than a lot of tools, but I still think that it has that pattern, that tendency of encouraging some choices and discouraging others, and so I think that like what we really look for is we want the objects that we create to not be limited by the constraints of any one specific tool. So we think of 3D printing as kind of another tool, a very powerful tool, but another tool kind of to be used alongside the CNC mill and the welder or whatever kind of other tools we might use. But I'd say that compared to most of those tools, the 3D printer I think can get you much closer to a finished product all by itself than maybe any other tool that I can think of. And while it does have constraints, I'd say it's much better than, say, a laser cutter, which was like, I'd say really rigid in terms of like the kinds of forms it would encourage you to create. So it's and also compared to a lot of these other tools, it's just gotten a lot easier for someone who doesn't have a lot of kind of general like machine shop knowledge or something like that. And in my mind, the kind of like mental benchmark for it is, say, an inkjet printer. Like if an inkjet printer prints out 100 pages with no problem, you're like, oh wow, that works, cool. You're like slightly surprised, but it usually works. And that's kind of, I'd say, where 3D printing is at the moment. It would be nice if it were a little bit more reliable, but I think it's good enough for the kinds of things that people would use it for in the experiential realm right now.
Yeah, are we getting past I remember whenever you had to plan so far ahead when you were doing any kind of 3D printing before because of the amount of time. I guess I don't, Christina, does that rely on the level of machine you have? If you have the $100 model, you should probably give yourself 3 days to get something printed, or is that still a limitation, or?
Kind of. So there are the cheaper machines, while they are great, they might not be able to be pushed in ways that the more expensive machines might be able to be pushed. Um, you might be limited in what you can or cannot print. Failure rates might be higher, so you would have to do a little bit more planning. But if you really know your machine, you could soup it up, and you can add things to it to make it a little bit better, add upgrades, or even just have an idea of like what you can and can't print on that machine, then you should be able to work with it just fine. I think it's very much like knowing what, for example, like in a wood shop, knowing what a hammer can do versus a screwdriver. It's like if you know your machine, you're good to go.
All right, cool. Or they can partner with cool places like Makelab, get the get the pro level service. When you're ready to press print on your experience design, you need to go to the right people, probably.
Yeah, our machines, we keep them tuned up, so they're pretty much ready with a low failure rate. So that is the alternative if you don't want to mess around with your own machine.
Yeah, that makes me think. So, Victoria, in terms of like collaboration among interdisciplinary collaboration and stuff, do you think that 3D printing is kind of a cool center for different people to come together? These artists can come in and start tapping the shoulders of the engineers and say, how can I make this thing?
I think it is. I mean, I would go back to what James and Christina both sort of referenced, knowing your tools and thinking about the design process and where 3D printing fits in. Here in our space, we kind of, in our very first introductory training, we teach the students how to use the 3D printers because I always see it as the gateway drug, right? Like once you once you kind of start to learn how to use this, right, you are really excited. It kind of opens your mind up to new possibilities, maybe that would never have even occurred to you if you don't see it in operation, if you don't see what can come out of it and touch it and feel it and think about ways that can be incorporated in other designs. And then there's so many other tools, right? I know we're here to talk about 3D printing, but Christina talked about the laser cutters, so now I have free reign. I think just as there's that sort of like collaborative interdisciplinary need per project, right? You also have to think about the tools that go into the design. You have to think about the entire design process, and we try to teach students that. I think it's something, you learn by doing. That's kind of the ethos of making in makerspaces. We do see, again, having more majors and programs and collaboration across NYU happening here, and that does help with the complexity of the projects. We see a lot of longer term projects that are now happening because we have the makerspace. So I think it's, again, thinking about it as sort of a gateway, right? You're building that complexity, that mental complexity that's possible in a project. And 3D printing is definitely a really great place to start because it really like sparks that, right? So I think that's why students love it. I think it's why people love it. I think, it's something that we all sort of get excited by when we see. So I feel lucky to be a part of that.
Cool. Yeah, it is almost going to be an inkjet printer level thing that we all just use pretty soon. I guess that makes me speculate a little bit about the future. And James, I know you have a pile of NDAs, but I guess everyone in our audience will be curious to know about the interactivity that might be able to be built in maybe to some of the materials. Do you see any point where we're like this, like the actual material itself could be interactive in a new way, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I think that there are a lot of, in the experiential realm, there are a lot of like really interesting things that are where the technology is ready now that I haven't really seen done yet, at least on any sort of scale. One is I mean, people have done this a little bit, but they're, I think, just scratched the surface. Like one is, instant customization, right? So when someone comes to, say a product launch or whatever, kind of experience that a brand is putting on, they love it if they can take away something that's been personalized just for them. And, this could be anything from, something relatively unimaginative, like your name kind of printed on something, but you could go much further than that. There's a company a few years ago that was trying to 3D print a visual representation of a dream that you had. So, collecting, I guess, like electrical data as you sleep, and then turning that into a 3D sculpture. And then, there's a pretty broad space in between there of, things that you can do. We worked on a project for the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. This was with small design and hypersonic, and this was a permanent installation. It's a donor wall, and basically there are, I think, 275 different zebrafish. So zebrafish are really important in medical research, and each of the fish that was on this wall was 3D printed, and each one was unique. It was kind of in a different sort of a slightly different pose, and that kind of thing is something that 3D printing really makes possible, and I feel like that can really be pushed much farther than it is now. And I think beyond that, embedding electronics in 3D printed objects is super interesting, and there is definitely some work on having the electronics be printed as by the same printer, but there'll be a long time before you can get the sort of level of performance out of a circuit like that you can get with a traditional technique. But you can, today you can just have a little slot in your 3D printed object and just slide your circuit board in there to do whatever you want. So, there are a lot of things that can happen with that technology today. Honestly, like, I feel like what's true with any new technology is, the limiting factors, I mean, this sounds cheesy, but the limiting factor is really just imagination at the end of the day. It takes a while for a new technology being around for people to say, oh, well, we're no longer bound by this constraint that we had with this previous technology. So why don't we start doing, and then people realize that, and then you get this kind of flood of new, kinds of activity or projects. And I feel like that's where we are with 3D printing and, experiential, kinds of applications where there's just a huge space of things you can do with just really simple sensors, maybe a coin cell battery inside a 3D printed object. It's like a, totally new, like, non-screen based way of interaction. And one of the things that we really like to push in our work is group experiences that are about face-to-face connection of people in the group, not just kind of the whole group doing something like focusing their attention elsewhere. And this, I really see 3D printing as kind of an enabling technology for that kind of realm of work. So lots of possibilities.
Yeah, that makes me pretty giddy about what could come next. Because, like you said, this is the perfect time too to, as we're all on pause and different variations of pause, to start exploring what we might do next. And Victoria, I know you. It seems like, what are you seeing? I saw you nodding a lot, Victoria, to what James was saying. I wonder if you're already starting to see some of the possibilities he's describing with some of the experimentation that's happening there.
Definitely, I think. So I have two things that came to mind. I think one larger idea that's been on my mind a lot recently is collaboration in the now, right? So my lab is closed. We're getting ready to open in the fall. We're doing some service work for faculty. But again, it's about the community, and how can we have that when we are socially distant? And I think that speaks to what James just said, right? About new types of interaction. And I think these tools that we have, especially like AR and VR, 3D printing and digital design, I think that we're going to really be seeing some innovative new use cases. And I think it'll be out of just need. Like now we need them, right? To really work on projects, we need, maybe a lot more video portals is a project I'm thinking about right now. Maybe we have these little kits that students check out and then they work, one is in the space or two are in the space, and then, their teammates in their dorm room or in their apartment coding or giving them advice or, doing a circuit design or something else. So I don't know. I think it's a larger conversation, and it's just been on my mind. I think it'll be interesting to see how future generations of students who've dealt with this, the ideas that they have, the needs that they have, and how that translates into design work and engineering work in the future. And then again, I think the other thing that James spoke about that kind of spoke to me was, I think also PCB design and electronics. I think there's a lot there that's confusing unnecessarily. It can be broken down. There are a lot of resources online. My background is electrical engineering, so I come from that, but it doesn't need to be that way, right? For the rest of us, for the world, maybe you don't have an engineering degree. There's so many resources out there, and I think there's just such a enormous strength and leap forward that you can take in your interaction designs, in your design work in general, and in projects that you work on as a student. When you start to, when those become more accessible, basically.
Wow. Yeah, I think I think the leaps we're all about to take are going to be really great. I think there's a lot we can do next. And I think there is going to be a lot of freedom, like you said, instead of the constraints where we don't feel like we have the expertise to do some of these things. I guess a lot of people can start making moves in directions that they didn't think they could do before, which is, is that, I guess wrapping up, maybe let's think about, I wanted to ask Christina a little bit about that. Like, how are you seeing people feeling this new latitude to be able to move into new areas, moving forward and new people coming into the field and feeling like they can start to express themselves with this medium? I guess, what do you see happening in the future?
Basically, because we're a service bureau, we work with so many different clients, so we really get to see how different industries are doing. And one thing I've noticed is that our business is totally dependent on business productivity. So when COVID first hit and quarantine happened in New York, we saw a bit of a drop in just order volume and revenue and everything pretty much, because people were transitioning to working from home. Maybe things that they needed printed before, they didn't need to print anymore because everything was virtual. Are you going to send it to your boss and review over Zoom? Are you going to make 2 copies? Or are you just going to send a rendering? Maybe something interactive. So it's been quite interesting. But what I'm seeing is that people really do enjoy that physicality of the object. So in the sense of prototyping, things are revving back up, which is like, whew, as a business owner, that's very relieving. And I think as an industry, it's also just nice to see that, spirits are still high. People want to get back to work. I think people were a little overworked from quarantine just because working from home, you really have 0 separation. And I heard from a lot of people that they were working probably until like 10 at night just because they were at home and they were in their home office. So it's really good to see people kind of itching to get back in a sense. I know that it's a completely new normal, but it's just been really enlightening to see.
Victoria, what do you see next as the school tries to reopen in some capacity in the fall?
I think there's going to be a focus on digital tools, of course. There always is, but it'll be renewed. I think, we do expect to have less students on campus. I think most schools are approaching a very mixed model or going completely online. As of this time, NYU is planning on a mixed model, but that could change. Again, I think going back to new ways to support collaboration, I think is what we'll really see. I do think that we're going to see a lot of printing, and it'll just necessarily have to be service printing. Like we can't all be printing. There's just no way. I can't have the same volume in my lab until we have a vaccine, or even after that, you know? So I think there is an element of learning that is still very important in that. I mean, not just in the design itself, but in, you know, for our students thinking about a real world skill that they're developing, you know, when you go out into industry, you might not have a makerspace in your specific location, right? But you still need to know how to utilize those resources in most industries, to be quite honest, as an engineer and designer. You know, it's not everyone, for sure, but it is a tool. It is a pretty ubiquitous tool now. So I think that's what we'll see in the near future. And I think the skill of working remotely and thinking about new ways of doing design and production are going to be impacting us for a while.
James, I liked your story about how you felt it was urgent to get this printer before all of this began. So yeah, I guess the question is, now that it's become such a tool of necessity, where do you see things heading next in experience design with this technology?
Well, a problem that Victoria alluded to, which we're running into, and I think it's relevant for all different kinds of companies right now, is, I mean, there's just I'd say a lot of gaps in the current digital tools. Christina mentioned this too, like just that having the physical object is so much better. And you know, one thing that we're really seeing in the kind of work we do is like, we're really just much more effective when we're all in the same room. And, you know, I think that, I think what Victoria said about seeing a bunch of new tools and you know, new ways of using digital tools and you know, new kinds of, like a lot of innovation in that space, I think is something that's really ripe to happen now. And you know, like when you know, it seems like we're kind of entering this period of economic at a minimum uncertainty, right? But you know, usually in these periods of economic disruption, there are, you know, a lot of people who kind of hole up in their, you know, their bedroom or whatever with their tools, and they come out at the end of that with some amazing new idea. And I feel like, you know, if you're going to pick a tool to do that with now, the 3D printer is probably the tool that you want. And so I'm, you know, like I mentioned some ideas for experiential stuff before, and I think that like we're really just scratching the surface there. But more generally, kind of collaboration in general, you know, what are the tools that we need to do that, which I think, you know, there are a lot of screen-based tools and lots of people are working on that, but I think that there are also going to be some really interesting physical tools that, or part physical, part digital tools that we'll start to see. And yeah, I think 3D printing will be a huge part of that.
Oh, all right. Well, there's a note of optimism in there, because I think we all do, especially, you know, everyone on this podcast and everyone listening to it. I think that's their tendency. Yeah. Like, what can I learn now? What can I build next? And you all have given us a lot of ideas and inspiration for what we can build next. So I really thank you for coming here and talking with us about this, and thanks. And I can't wait to find out what you build next. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to the Tide Generator podcast, produced by AVIXA. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time.